Inside America's Boardrooms, the informational show for board members and corporate secretaries. Brought to you with Knowledge Partners, Diligent, PwC, Center for Audit Quality, the Conference Board, and Corporate Board Member. Along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, Donnelly Financial Solutions, and the Society for Corporate Governance.
Welcome to this episode of Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm Doug Chia, the Executive Director of the Governance Center at the Conference Board, and your host for today, standing in for the show's regular host, TK Kerstetter, who should be back next week. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this show, which is being filmed at the Conference Board Studios in New York City. Today we're going to be talking about a very important letter that was recently issued by Larry Fink, the Chairman and CEO of BlackRock, which is the world's largest asset management firm. And joining me is Judith Samuelson, who's Vice President and Founder and Executive Director of the Business and Society Program at the Aspen Institute. So Judy, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Larry Fink has been writing this letter to CEOs annually for a couple years now. And this year's letter is titled A Sense of Purpose. How do you interpret this title and what's in the letter?
Well, he's been doing these annual letters, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years now. I think he's been issuing letters of this nature, stepping into a conversation directly with, CEOs of basically the entire market. I mean, much less the largest companies in the country and beyond. I think the use of purpose is, a lot of people are talking about the purpose right now of the corporation, purpose of, human purpose. I mean, purpose has become a word that is being bandied about a lot. I think his choice of it is a wise choice, and I think it takes us, what's interesting about it is it takes us away from the sidelines and into the kind of DNA of what companies are actually about and what their business model produces and what they measure and how you define success. And so I think it's a real step up into a current conversation that it's an interesting choice to be a part of in his position.
And, but as an investor, what's his interest in talking about purpose and what some commentators are now saying that, he's delving into social issues here?
Well, I'm pretty clear that that's not what he's saying in this letter.
Okay.
He is in the largest sense of he is delving into a continuing conversation that we've been having in this country since its founding about the intersection of commerce and the health of society. In some ways, that conversation's been going on from the time of Aristotle. But I think he is, BlackRock. You've already said it. They're really the largest asset manager, the largest investor. They own, thousands of companies. They own a significant piece of the ownership of the shares of stock. Some 5%, 10%. It can be even more. So they are a massive investor. They've been growing rapidly. So his decision to step into this, I believe, is all about what he thinks is the health of the overall enterprise, and that BlackRock won't continue to flourish. Their investors can't possibly do well. They're an index investor. Everybody knows that means they can't exit. So they are left holding the bag, in essence, in terms of how individual companies perform. So I think purpose is one lens into the long-term direction of a company. And long-term is what BlackRock has to be all about, at least through their index funds.
Got it. Okay. Well, you read the text of the letter, and, some people say, well, look, this is nothing new. This is nothing that hasn't been said before by other folks, in business and academia. And it's what we in the governance field call the Stakeholder Model of corporate governance. You call this letter a game changer. And so why is this letter a game changer?
I think it's a game changer because I don't think it's about the stakeholder model. I mean, that stakeholder, I think he is, and it certainly got characterized that way in the press. I think if you're clear, if he's asking companies a couple of things. One is he's asking them to be explicit about why they exist. Second of all, he's saying you need to communicate that. You need to communicate that to investors like BlackRock and wider in the rest of the long-term investors in the market. If we're able to kind of have your back and understand your long-term strategy, we need to be able to be part of that conversation early on. But I think by talking about purpose and what is really their long-term strategy, he's opening up a question about the business model, not about the kind of social initiatives, as I think it was Andrew Ross Sorkin called it in his piece in the Times. He's really asking about what's the DNA of this company? What are you really about? How are you defining your long-term strategy? How are you going to measure success? That may, by force, that means boards will need to be clear about kind of which stakeholders are most important to their long-term success. They have to be clear about that. But I don't think he's opening up this kind of like how much over here for the shareholders, how much for the stakeholders over here. I think he's asking a deeper question about how you're really defining success in your enterprise.
But don't you think it's kind of counterintuitive that the largest investor of the world is not saying put the shareholder first?
Absolutely, that's important. And he's saying very clearly in this letter that in order for you to succeed and for us to both understand who you are and to really back you up, we have to be clear about why you exist in terms of the public interest here. So in some ways, he's taking us back to an earlier age when we were accustomed to companies being able to, way before our time, let's go back, much longer ago, 100 years ago, where companies were given the license to operate when it was clear what public purpose they were serving. For some very good reasons, that became kind of democratized, and anybody can start a company today. But he's asking an old question, but it's also one that's very relevant today because of the remarkable impact that companies can have, both for good and for ill. And so I think he's raising the bar and essentially saying, for us to really understand you and to be able to understand what you're about, we need to understand what your public interest is as well. And that, bringing in that language, I think is fresh.
And so, he's been issuing this letter for a couple of years now, or different letters.
Yeah.
The sense of purpose. Why sense of purpose now? Is it that, this is an opportunity? Is there a problem we're trying to fix? A little bit of both?
Well, let's look at some headlines from the last decade. I mean, you can see, and let's take one from last week. I mean, Facebook, it seems to me, is just the latest example of a company that was confounding what they say they're about and the real business model. And I think Fink is saying, we need to see how these are actually connecting. So what are you about, and what's your business model, and how are you going to communicate that? What's your strategy? What are you going to be? What do you want to be known for? But how are you going to operationalize it? So I think, we've seen this problem. We saw it in VW, we saw it in Wells Fargo, we saw it in, Valiant, clearly. We saw it, in Uber on several occasions at this point in Uber. This disconnect between, this is what we say we're about over here. This is what, if you really go into the DNA of what they're actually rewarding, measuring, what's producing the kind of profits that we see at a place like, Facebook, it may tell a very different story. So if we reread this letter today in light of what happened last week, I think we'd even see even more sharply how complex this endeavor is and what Fink is asking people to step up to.
And so the people he's asking to step up, it's addressed to CEOs, but clearly all board members should be reading it. And you studied this letter very carefully. What's the most important message to board members that you think is in this letter that might not dawn on them after just one reading?
I think it's almost spiritual. I mean, take this line: without a sense of purpose, no company, either public or private, can achieve its full potential. That's not the kind of conversation that we're usually having in boardrooms today. We certainly aren't having it in classrooms, or I do spend a lot of time. So I think it's a kind of a wake-up call. Business is by far our most influential institution of our day. We're not going to solve the big problems that were bound to the business environment without business taking the lead. We're pretty clear it's not going to happen from government, whether we're talking about climate change or we're talking about economic opportunity and the ramifications of a lot of people have been kind of thrown under the bus in an environment which has not served their interests over the long haul. I think we're asking a pretty fundamental question about what's business's role.
So let's take a time out and forget about all these kind of tactical issues that are creating a lot of noise and say, hey, what are we here for anyway? What do we even, why do we exist?
Yeah, I mean, there was a time when if you asked the question, we could have assumed that all businesses are creating social benefits. I mean, I believe that that's true throughout the entire kind of system of business, if you will. But the quick answer is always that businesses create jobs and pay taxes. We can't assume either of those today. In the environment of kind of tax avoidance that we have seen and witnessed on the local level, the major questions being asked about where jobs are going to come from in an environment of artificial intelligence, what that's going to mean. Are we really going to lose the jobs to the extent that is being kind of forecast at this point? So you kind of have to go back and essentially say, why have we granted the license to operate? Why have we given companies the privileges that were bound to them as corporations? Why have we offered limited liability to those who put their money at risk? So I think it's a kind of an interesting moment where business has to be part of the solution. We've seen a lot of things that have captured headlines that suggest that hasn't been the case. So even people like our enterprise business society program at Aspen, which believes deeply in the power of business to drive important change and to really lead on issues of major consequence, you have to kind of step back and say, what's the recipe for making sure that we stay on that course?
And not just in the societal context, but board members should be asking themselves about their specific company.
Yeah,
these
why
types
are they
of
on the
questions. Why does our company do what it does and how are we contributing? So, okay. Well, obviously we could talk about this for much longer, but we are out of time for today. So, Judy, thanks so much for joining us today. And that'll conclude this episode of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show, and we'll be back next week here at the Conference Board Studio to talk about another topic to help you become a better board member and committee member. Thank you.
Join us again next week for Inside America's Boardrooms. Brought to you with knowledge partners Diligent, PwC, Center for Audit Quality, the Conference Board, and Corporate Board Member. Along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Brazotti, Donnelly Financial Solutions, and the Society for Corporate Governance.